It is just past 9 in the evening, on the 25th of April 2009, on a stretch of Ocean Boulevard in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. A 17-year-old girl named Brittanee Marie Drexel walks alone, away from the Bluewater Resort, into the warm coastal night. She is wearing a black tank top, a black athletic shorts pair, and flip-flops. She is texting on a small flip phone. She does not look afraid. She looks like every other spring break teenager on the boardwalk that week. And that is exactly why nobody on the street remembers her face an hour later. The hotel surveillance camera at the Bluewater catches her leaving. The camera is mounted high on the side of the building, angled down toward the entrance. The image is not high definition. It is the standard grainy fixed-frame footage that hotels pulled from VHS tape recorders in 2009. But it is the last frame, the last documented image of Brittanee Drexel. She walks out, she turns south on Ocean Boulevard, and she disappears into 13 years of silence. This is the story of what happened on that walk. The story of a mother in Rochester, New York, who refused to let the case die. The story of an FBI announcement 7 years later that broke the family in half. And the story of a single, specific confession on a humid Charleston afternoon in May of 2022 that finally answered the question Dawn Drexel had been asking for 4,734 days. Brittanee Marie Drexel was the daughter of Dawn Drexel and Chad Drexel, raised in the suburb of Chile in upstate New York, just outside Rochester. She was a junior at Gates Chile High School in the spring of 2009. She was small, 5 feet, 99 pounds. Her friends remember her laugh more than anything else. Loud, surprised, the kind of laugh that made everyone in the room turn their head. She had a boyfriend back home named John Greco. She worked an after-school job at a fast food restaurant. She was saving money for prom. She also wanted, very badly, to go on spring break. A group of older girls she knew were planning a trip to Myrtle Beach. They had a hotel booked. They had a car. They had the entire week of school break in front of them. Brittanee asked her mother if she could go. Her mother said no. The reason was simple. Dawn Drexel did not want her 17-year-old daughter on a spring break trip 800 miles from home with an unsupervised group of older girls. So Dawn said no. Brittanee did not accept the no. On the morning of Sunday, April 19th, 2009, Brittanee told her mother she was going to spend a few days at a friend's house in nearby Henrietta. She packed a small bag. She kissed her mother goodbye. She got in a car with 3 other girls, and they drove south, through Pennsylvania, through Virginia, through North Carolina, and onto the long, flat stretch of Highway 17 that empties out into the Grand Strand of South Carolina. By Sunday evening, she was on the beach. She did not tell her mother where she really was for 2 days. When she finally did, the conversation was tense. But the trip was already happening, and Dawn Drexel was 800 miles away, in a kitchen in Chile, New York, holding a phone that could only ask her daughter to please be careful. The girls were staying at the Bluewater Resort on Ocean Boulevard. It is a tall coastal hotel painted pale blue and white, with balconies that look out over the Atlantic. The room they had booked was on a higher floor. It was not a fancy trip. Pizza, fast food, beach time, late nights. They were teenagers on a budget on the busiest stretch of beach in the southeastern United States during the busiest week of the year. On the evening of Saturday, April 25th, Brittanee told the girls she was going to walk to the Bluewater Resort. There was another hotel about 1.5 miles south called the Bluewater Resort with a slightly different spelling, where a male friend of her boyfriend was staying. She wanted to drop off a phone charger. She also wanted, according to text messages later recovered, to talk to him about her boyfriend back home. She left around 8:30 in the evening. She arrived at the Bluewater Resort sometime after 9. She left around 9:15, alone, on foot, walking back north along Ocean Boulevard toward her own hotel. The distance is about 1.5 miles. On a normal April evening, it would have taken her 25 minutes to walk it. She never arrived. The text messages stopped around 9:45. At first, the friends in the Bluewater room were not worried. Brittanee was a confident kid. She was probably stopping somewhere along the way. Maybe a gas station. Maybe a friend. Maybe she had run into someone from home on the boardwalk. The phone was silent for an hour, then 2 hours. Around midnight, one of the older girls called Dawn Drexel in New York and told her the truth. Brittanee was missing. The friends in Myrtle Beach had walked the boardwalk. They had checked the hotel room. They had called every number they had. Nothing. Dawn Drexel made the second call of her life that mattered. She called the Myrtle Beach Police Department. The officer who took the report did everything by the book. He filed Brittanee as a missing person. He flagged the case as endangered because of her age and the late hour. He pulled the surveillance tape from the Bluewater. He found the last known frame. A small girl in black, walking south on Ocean Boulevard, alive at 9:07 in the evening on April 25, 2009. That frame became the front of every flyer, every news story, and every billboard for the next 13 years. Dawn Drexel got in her car. She drove from Rochester to Myrtle Beach in about 15 hours, alone, stopping only for gas. She arrived in the parking lot of the Bluewater Resort the next morning. She has said in interviews that she does not remember the drive. She remembers only her hands on the wheel and the sound of the radio she could not turn off, and the certainty, somewhere south of Richmond, that her daughter was already gone. She did not believe Brittanee had run away. She knew her daughter. Brittanee had a boyfriend back home, a job, a saved-up prom dress fund, and a flip phone with charged battery. She had also called her mother at 8:12 that evening, just 20 minutes before she walked out the door of the Bluewater. She had said, on that call, that she would be back at the room by 10 and that she loved her. Children who are about to disappear do not say, "I love you" on a phone call to their mother. Dawn Drexel knew that the way every mother in America knows it. She started the search the moment she stepped out of her car. The search lasted longer than the brief on the news ever suggested. There were leads in Myrtle Beach. There were leads in Florida. There were leads on backwoods roads in Georgia. There were tipsters who came forward with names and pulled them back the next day. There were hoaxes. There were psychics. There were quiet phone calls from law enforcement that suggested progress that never materialized. Brittanee's flip phone last pinged a cell tower in McClellanville, South Carolina, more than 50 miles south of Myrtle Beach, in the early hours of April 26, 2009. McClellanville is a small fishing town deep in the Low Country, surrounded by salt marsh and cypress swamp. It is not on the way back to the Bluewater Resort. It is not a place a teenage girl on foot from Ocean Boulevard could reach by accident. The ping was a clue with no follow-up evidence to attach to it. For 7 years it sat in the file. In the months after Brittanee disappeared, Dawn Drexel did something that almost every parent in her position eventually has to do. She became, by necessity, a part-time investigator. She made her own missing person flyers and shipped them in cardboard boxes to gas stations along the eastern seaboard. She built a website. She kept a binder. The binder grew thicker every month. She hired a private investigator. She traveled back to Myrtle Beach more than 50 times in the first 3 years. She walked the boardwalk at night. She knocked on the doors of the Bluewater. She handed flyers to bartenders, hotel clerks, taxi drivers, and lifeguards. She remembered names that other people forgot, and she made phone calls every Sunday afternoon to detectives in 3 states asking the same question. Are you still working her case? The detectives in Myrtle Beach worked the case in shifts. The lead investigator at the Myrtle Beach Police Department in the first months was a sergeant who eventually retired without seeing it close. The case was reassigned. It was reassigned again. By 2012, the file had grown to several thousand pages and was being maintained jointly by Myrtle Beach Police, the FBI Charleston Field Office, and the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office. In 2010, a young woman in Florida came forward with a story she said she had heard secondhand from an inmate. The story placed Brittanee in a house in McClellanville. The story was detailed. It was checked. Investigators traveled to McClellanville, and walked the property in question. They did not find anything that could be charged. The lead, like 100 others, became part of the file. The next year, another tip placed Brittanee in Georgia. The year after that, in Texas. None of them produced anything that could be charged. Through all of it, Dawn Drexel kept the family in the news. She made appearances on every cable network with a true crime segment. She wrote letters to the United States Attorney for the District of South Carolina. She organized a vigil on the boardwalk every April 25th. She carried a small framed photograph of Brittanee with her in her purse. The photograph was the same one that had been on the original missing person flyer in 2009. By 2015, the photograph was so creased along the corners that the image had begun to bleach. In June of 2016, the FBI held a press conference in South Carolina. The supervising agent stepped to the microphone and said, on the record, that the agency now believed Brittanee had been taken to a stash house in McClellanville, where she had been held against her will and ultimately killed, and that her remains had been disposed of in nearby waters. The announcement was based on the testimony of an inmate at a federal prison who claimed to have witnessed the events. Dawn Drexel sat in the audience. She had spent 7 years waiting for an answer. The answer she got that morning was the worst answer a mother can hear, and it was an answer with no body, no killer named, and no charges filed. The FBI's working theory was now public. The case was, somehow, both confirmed as a homicide and still completely unsolved. For another 6 years, that was where the case stayed. In May of 2022, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division and the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office announced that they had arrested a man named Raymond Douglas Moody. Moody was 62 years old. He was a registered sex offender. He had served a previous prison sentence in California in the 1980s for the kidnapping and assault of another young woman. He had been living in the Myrtle Beach area in April of 2009. He had been on the radar of investigators for years. He had also been, until that point, just one of many names in a thick file. What changed in 2022 was a confession. Moody walked investigators through the events of April 25th. He admitted that he had encountered Brittanee Drexel on Ocean Boulevard that evening. He admitted that he had taken her to a wooded area in Georgetown County. He admitted to the assault and to the murder, and he led investigators to the location where he had buried her, in the woods of Georgetown County. On a humid afternoon in May of 2022, the team recovered Brittanee Drexel's remains. The dental records confirmed the identification within 48 hours. Dawn Drexel got the call she had been waiting 13 years to receive. Her daughter was found. On October 19, 2022, Raymond Moody appeared in a Georgetown County courtroom and pleaded guilty to murder, kidnapping, and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 30 additional years stacked on top of that sentence as a procedural finality. The courtroom was full. Dawn Drexel sat in the front row with her family. When she stood to speak during the victim impact portion of the hearing, she did not yell. She did not curse the man who had killed her daughter. She held a small photograph in her hand. The photograph was of Brittanee on the beach, taken 3 days before she died, smiling into a coastal wind. Dawn Drexel said, in a voice that did not break, that her daughter had been a person and not a case, and not a face on a flyer and not a cold case file, and that she had been loved, and that she would always be loved, and that the silence that had lasted 13 years and 6 months and 24 days was finally over. To understand how the case finally closed, you have to understand who Raymond Douglas Moody had been before April 25, 2009. Moody was born in 1960. He had a long history of arrests and convictions for sexual offenses going back to the 1980s. In 1983, in California, he was convicted of the kidnapping and rape of a young woman in San Diego County. He served roughly 2 decades in California State Prison. He was released in 2004. His name was placed on the South Carolina Sex Offender Registry when he relocated to the Lowcountry several years later. By April of 2009, Moody was living in a recreational vehicle on the property of a woman he had been dating in Georgetown County. The location was about 40 minutes south of Ocean Boulevard. He had a vehicle. He had unstructured time. He had a documented prior history of stranger abduction. He was not, in police language, an unknown suspect. He was a known offender who had not yet been connected to a current case. Investigators interviewed Moody in the months after Brittanee's disappearance. They interviewed him again in 2011. They interviewed him a third time in 2015. He denied involvement every time. There was no physical evidence connecting him to Brittanee's last known route. There was no witness placing him at the Bluewater. There was no DNA match because there was, at that point, no body. What changed in 2022 was a combination of factors. Investigators executed a new round of search warrants on properties Moody had occupied in 2009, including the Georgetown County recreational vehicle site. The search recovered evidence that, in combination with previously gathered material, allowed a grand jury to return charges. With charges filed and the prospect of a capital case looming, Moody's defense counsel and the solicitor's office began to discuss a plea agreement. As part of that agreement, Moody walked investigators back to the location where he had buried Brittanee. The location was in a wooded portion of Georgetown County, miles from any public road. Without his cooperation, the remains might never have been found. Go back to the surveillance image. The grainy hotel camera. The girl in black. The last known frame at 9:07 on the evening of April 25, 2009. For 13 years, that frame was a question. It was the still photograph that opened every news segment about the case. It was the image a grieving mother saw every time she closed her eyes. The image of a daughter walking south, walking out of the world. After October 2022, the frame is something else. It is no longer a question. It is the last moment that Brittanee Marie Drexel was alive in a world that had not yet known her name. It is the boundary between a teenager on a beach and a name on a courtroom docket. It is the line between the trip her mother said no to and the answer her mother eventually got, with all the weight of every day in between. The case of Brittanee Drexel is not, in the end, a story about a stranger on a boardwalk. It is a story about a mother who refused to let a case go quiet. It is a story about a community in Myrtle Beach that handed out flyers on the boardwalk every spring break for 13 years. It is a story about an FBI agent who stood at a podium in 2016 and told the truth even when the truth was unfinished. It is a story about a confession in a wooded part of South Carolina that finally let a family bury a daughter in a cemetery in Rochester, New York. It is also a story that could not have been told, in this form, without the small details that survived. The phone ping in McClellanville, the Bluewater surveillance frame, the text messages on a flip phone, the dental records that closed the file, the names, the dates, the places, the receipts of an investigation that refused to fade. If you watched this episode all the way through, you watched it because those small details added up to something a teenager from Rochester could not say for herself. Her name was Brittanee Marie Drexel. She was 17 years old, and she came home after the October 2022 sentencing. The case did not simply close. The aftershocks of a 13-year disappearance do not end on the day a sentence is handed down. They continue in 3 different directions at once for years. The first direction is the legal direction. Raymond Moody filed appeals. The appeals were procedural and were ultimately denied. The case was finalized at the appellate level in the spring of 2024. Moody is now serving his sentence at a maximum security correctional facility in South Carolina. He has not given any further public statements about the case beyond his guilty plea. The second direction is the institutional direction. The Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted a quiet internal review of the 7 years between Brittanee's disappearance and the FBI's 2016 press conference. The review examined how an inmate witness statement had been weighed, how the McClellanville lead had been pursued, and how the line of communication with the Drexel family had been maintained. The recommendations from that review, while not made public, are understood within the Bureau to have shaped the way long-running missing person cases are now handled out of the Charleston field office. The third direction is the family direction. Dawn Drexel did not stop after the sentencing. She continued the work she had begun in 2009. She traveled to other families' vigils. She spoke at conferences for the parents of missing children. She testified in 2023 in front of a state legislative committee in South Carolina that was considering a bill to expand the resources available to families of long-running missing person cases. She kept the small framed photograph of Brittanee with her every time. By that point, the photograph had been laminated. The original creases were still visible underneath the lamination, like fault lines preserved in glass. In Myrtle Beach itself, the story is now part of the local memory of the boardwalk. There is a small memorial bench, placed by donations, near the Bluewater Resort. The bench faces the ocean. The dedication plaque on the bench is short. It does not name the man who killed her. It names only Brittanee Marie Drexel of Rochester, New York, and the dates of her birth and her death. Spring break tourists walk past the bench every April, and most of them do not know what it is. The locals know. Spring break in Myrtle Beach is one of the largest spring break gatherings in the United States. The Grand Strand stretches for 60 miles along the South Carolina coast, anchored by Myrtle Beach in the middle. And during the last 2 weeks of April, it absorbs hundreds of thousands of high school and college students from the entire eastern half of the country. The Bluewater Resort, where Brittanee Drexel was staying in 2009, sits in one of the busiest blocks of Ocean Boulevard. The boardwalk is alive at night with music, with neon signs, with vendors, and with crowds that pulse against the railings. For the 13 years between 2009 and 2022, the Drexel family ran a memorial event on the boardwalk every April 25th. The event drew family members, friends, true crime followers, and increasingly, parents of other missing teenagers from across the country. The event was small at first. By the 10th anniversary, it had become a coordinated multi-state vigil, with simultaneous gatherings in Rochester, in Myrtle Beach, and in several other cities along the eastern seaboard. Volunteers handed out flyers with Brittanee's photograph. The flyers had her name in large type at the top. They had her age, her height, her last known clothing description, and the case file number with the Myrtle Beach Police Department. They asked, at the bottom, the same question every flyer had asked since 2009. Have you seen me? After 2022, the vigil did not end. It evolved. It is now a vigil for missing persons more broadly, hosted under a permanent organizational umbrella, and the photograph at the front of the gathering is Brittanee's, but the photographs that line the path to the stage belong to 100 other young people, whose families are still waiting for an answer. The Drexel family has spoken publicly about the responsibility they feel, having received their own answer, to stand with the families who have not. There is a final note that has to be said carefully about cases like this one. The vast majority of missing person cases in the United States never receive the level of attention that the Brittanee Drexel case received. The reasons are complicated. They have to do with race, with class, with media coverage patterns, and with the visual nature of the surveillance still that became the front of every news segment. Other young women disappeared in South Carolina in the spring of 2009. Their names are also in the file. Their families also waited. The Drexel family has, in interviews since, made a point of saying so. The recommendation of this channel on every case it covers is that the work of one family's search should not become a referendum on which families do or do not get media attention. It is a referendum, instead, on what can be accomplished when a family refuses to stop, when a community keeps a flyer up on the boardwalk for 13 consecutive springs, and when an investigator decides, against the temptation to close the file, to keep working. Go back, one more time, to the surveillance image. The grainy hotel camera. The girl in black. The last known frame at 9:07 on the evening of April 25, 2009. There is a version of this story in which that frame remains, forever, the only frame. There is a version in which Dawn Drexel is still flying down to Myrtle Beach every spring break, still walking the boardwalk, still asking the same question. That version of the story would have been the version most missing person cases get. The version in which the answer never arrives. The version that exists instead is one in which the frame became a beginning rather than an ending. The frame put Brittanee's face in front of the country every year. The frame made the case impossible to forget. The frame, in the end, generated the public pressure and the institutional persistence that produced a confession in a wooded part of Georgetown County 13 years and 6 months later. That is what a last known frame can do. It cannot save the person in the frame. By the time the camera captures the moment, the future is already happening. But the frame can change what happens after. It can hold a name in the public memory. It can keep a case open. It can give a mother something to point to on the worst nights when she is alone in a kitchen in Rochester, New York. And the only thing left is the small, blurry, time-stamped image of her 17-year-old daughter walking south on Ocean Boulevard at 9:07 in the evening, alive in the world. There is a generation watching this video right now that was in elementary school when Brittanee Drexel disappeared. Some of you were not born yet. The case predates Instagram in the form we know it. It predates Snapchat. It predates the platform that this video is on, in the version that matters. And yet the case lands. Part of the reason is that the architecture of the disappearance is the architecture of every disappearance that has happened since. A young woman tells a small lie to a parent. A boyfriend gets a phone call. A surveillance camera catches the back of a head. A search begins. A search slows down. A search becomes a Facebook page. A Facebook page becomes a foundation. A foundation becomes a law. A law becomes the reason the next case gets solved faster. Brittanee Drexel did not get the benefit of that architecture. She built it. Other families inherited it. The other reason the case lands is the boardwalk frame itself. A teenager walking south along Ocean Boulevard, alone, on a phone. There is nothing in the frame that warns you. There is nothing in the body language that says she knows. The frame is, in the most literal sense, the last second of one version of her life. Frames like this exist for almost everyone in this generation. Ring camera footage of you leaving the house. A parking lot camera at the gas station. A door camera at the apartment hallway. The Instagram story you posted from the car. The location ping that timestamps a snap. Most of those frames will mean nothing. They will be deleted on a 30-day rotation by a security company you have never heard of. But every now and then, one of them becomes the most important image in a homicide investigation. That is the contract of being alive in 2026. We are recorded constantly, almost completely, almost everywhere. The recording does not protect us. It documents us. The difference matters. Brittanee Drexel's last known frame was a documentation. It did not save her. It identified her. It became the photograph her family had to live next to for 13 years. And when Raymond Moody was finally arrested, that frame was the first thing every news outlet in America reached for. Because that frame is the case. The frame is the case. That sentence is going to come back in every episode of this channel, because it is true of every case we are going to cover. There is always a last frame. The job of this show is to find it, sit with it, and try to understand what it was actually showing us before we knew what we were looking at. If you have a case you want covered on this channel, the email is in the description. The next episode of Last Known Frame drops on Friday. It is the case of a young woman who vanished on a cross-country road trip in 2021, and the body camera footage from a small town in Utah that should have changed everything.